I have friends who've gone the whole hog tracing their family history, even taking formal qualifications in genealogy on the back of it. My efforts are more modest and deliberately so, but they still tell a compelling story. I've used some of the standard tools available on the web to gather information, and apart from being a fine exercise that provided a lot of interesting answers and backstory, it did of course raise many other as yet unanswered questions. I know enough about my family since 1910, so I've taken the line of my father, George Middlemiss Barnes, born in Hartlepool in 1910, and traced it back to 1791, when his grandfather, John Barnes, was born, as the record says, with unknown father and mother, which is a convenient full stop in my backward search, which I ask you to accept. I would go further back if there had been any hint of royal lineage, but alas no, this isn't a TV special. From the overall information which has come to light, my father's line has never had any money worth speaking of, and I suspect that John Barnes's forebears will have lived a life on the breadline, much like the rest of the general population around the country back in those times. And so too, the parish under Clay Hill. The Barnes family come from Causley in Wiltshire, on the border with Somerset. Warminster and Frome are the local market towns, just a few miles east and west respectively. Clay Hill overlooks Causley, and to quote Maud Davis in her book Life of an English Village, published in 1909, "The visitor who climbs to the summit of the hill usually inquires after a survey, where is the village? The remarkable fact being that with a population of 700 to 800 there is no village properly speaking. The dwellings lie scattered over the area in hamlets, in groups of 2 or 3, or in solitary houses. There are 9 principal hamlets plus other smaller ones, dating from feudal times. There is a place named Causley, but in fact the people are spread over nearly 5 square miles in places with other names, but nevertheless coming under the umbrella of Causley, making the tracing of cottages and exact locations more difficult." I can vouch for that from my own experience. I found the Barnes family abode a part of Rose Cottages, which has changed over time in shape and size, as explained at length in the Longleat Archives, a source of much useful information, including confirmation that John Barnes did indeed live there. My first point of interest is to try and find out why my father's line, in this case through John Barnes's son George, a name which has continued through the family up to the present day, why he ended up in the northeast of England, 300 miles from the ancestral home area, at a time when people generally stayed in their own local area due to the lack of opportunity and a transport system to enable such a move. At that time, and to quote an article in British History Online, Causley's cloth trade flourished chiefly in the 18th century, but survived until the 1840s, and by the end of the 19th century, only about 1/8 of the households had an income insufficient to provide necessary food and clothing. This relative prosperity was largely due to the good gardens attached to the cottages, the abundance of allotment land, and the number of small holdings in the parish. So, Causley is a largely self-sufficient and prosperous community, which all sounds good, but I have no indication that the Barnes family were part of that relative local prosperity. John Barnes was born 1791 in Causley, died there, and was buried in 1860. Not that we could find his grave, but of course he may not have had a traditional one. The church holds no records, more digging would be required. In the 1841 census, at the age of 50, John Barnes is listed as a millman of cloth. A millman of cloth. This tells me that he worked in the local cloth trade in a mill, of which there was one in Causley, up a still public path from where I know he lived at that time, in Rose Cottages. There were a few other mills scattered around the river valleys in the area, But to believe what is said in the article I mentioned, if the cloth trade only lasted until the 1840s, what happened then? Another ongoing mystery at this time. John married Martha Watts in 1810. They would both have been 19, so where did they live? From investigation, the Barnes and the Watts families lived as next-door neighbours in the property on Bugwell Hill in Causley. Indeed, the Watts family lived in the original cottage since the early 18th century, and which was split in two at a point in time to form Rose Cottages. And the two families lived that way for over 20 years. They never owned the cottages. They paid a rent of 1 shilling per year, seemingly fixed at that for many decades. But at least it made courting between John and Martha somewhat easier living next door to each other. The picture you are looking at whilst you listen to my dulcet tones is of Rose Cottages, seen around 2023. Will this incarnation of the building be familiar to John from around 200 years ago? This marriage between John and Martha resulted in 7 children, all born in Causley between 1815 and 1835. 3 of the 7, Harriet, Maria and Noah, lived long lives, 86, 73 and 79 respectively, and hard-working ones. There's no information on 2 others, Henry and Eliza, and the youngest, Sophia, became the head of the household by 1861, meaning that everyone else had moved out. She eventually married a tea merchant from Frome. All of which leaves George, my direct descendant. He left home. Was it for better paid work? Did he have an entrepreneurial spirit? Was he thrown out? For whatever reason, George did indeed leave his home village at the age of 21. He left the rest of his large family behind, most of whom rarely moved in their lifetimes more than a few miles from Causley, on the edge of the Longleat estate and very much tied to it in all respects. George was born on the 6th of June 1829, the 5th of the 7 Barnes children. By the age of 22, he was a puddler, a worker of iron at the furnace, living as a lodger in Bedwellty in the South Wales valleys, around 80 miles northeast of Causley. Puddling is hot and heavy work, so he must have been strong and, one would imagine, a valued worker. When 23, he married Anne Bynon in Abergavenny, Monmouthshire, and they went to live in Victoria, Ebbw down another Welsh valley, where there was an enormous iron and steel works, which from existing photographic evidence bears a striking resemblance to hell on earth and a world away from rural Causley. George and Anne had 6 children of their own, of which Edward, the eldest, my direct ancestor, born in 1853 in South Wales, and more on him and his shortly, with Hannah born there 3 years later. By the late 1850s, and when he was in his late 20s, George, my direct ancestor, had moved his family the 300 miles north from South Wales to County Durham, where a new iron steel foundry was being built at Witton Park to take advantage of the geology, the water supply and rail links to the North Sea ports. And this is where John, Martha Jane and George were born between 1856 and 1869. Was he headhunted or did he apply for a job? There wouldn't be many experienced puddlers around at that time, especially in an area new to heavy industry, so I think he may have been recruited in, probably at a decent wage. He lived in Escombe near Bishop Auckland, according to the census. This is a mere 2 miles from Witton Park, so he may have commuted. In other words, he probably walked to work. Within another 10 years, he had moved to Stranton on the southern edge of Hartlepool's town centre, where the 6th child, Frederick Charles, was born and also died in 1871. Edward, meanwhile, was still puddling. Certainly the area was in full industrial development mode, but moving to Linthorpe, a suburb of Middlesbrough, with his family and listed as a labourer in the 1881 census, as was his son John, before Edward's wife Anne dies in Sunderland in 1885 after 33 years of marriage. And he is last heard of as a lodger in a house in Merrington between Sunderland and Durham. None of his family were looking after him, seemingly, and no death record is immediately accessible, so a quiet end to a lifetime of labour. But coming back to my direct line, my grandfather Edward Bynon Barnes, at 18 years old in 1871, followed in his father's footsteps as a puddler and living in the family home in Stranton. He married Hannah Rose Knox from Wrexham in North Wales, I wonder how they met, in 1876, and lived in Hartlepool working as a shipyard engine man, more heavy work. 20 years later, it was still just Edward and Hannah Rose, but they'd moved again in Hartlepool, and now he was a furniture dealer on his own account, as it says, which I take to be self-employed. Interestingly, in the 1901 census, somebody had written Australia alongside Victoria for a reason unknown, as we know from previous census returns and everything else that he was born in Victoria, South Wales. Edward's wife Hannah died in 1906 in Hartlepool without children from their 30 years of marriage. But Edward was married again the following year to Maria Elizabeth Middlemiss from Stranton. She 20, and he 54. They soon had 3 children: Edward, born in 1907, Edith in 1909, and George Middlemiss Barnes, my father and inheritor of the Middlemiss name, born on Christmas Day 1910. So my paternal grandfather, Edward Bynon Barnes, died the 11th of December 1913, aged 57, in Hartlepool, leaving the princely sum of £45 10 shillings, which is about £7,000 in 2024 money, leaving it to his wife. And there ends my brief search into one family line. I can paint pictures in my own mind of what life must have been like for the Barnes line through the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Hard work and low pay dominate, and not much to show for it all, much like it was for millions of others at the same time. But they made it through the rain, living mostly long lives in spite of the physical toil. As a postscript, Sue and I visited Causley in 2023 on our way back from Cornwall. Indeed, it is a green and pleasant place, especially when viewed from the top of Clay Hill, as we did. We even managed to walk around the outside of Rose Cottages, as the building was about to undergo a complete remodelling. But I could imagine I was there 200 years ago, couldn't I?